Welcome to Great Power Politics. In today's class, I would like to move away from the narrative of country-specific or region-specific look like we had in recent classes, and we'll look at the international system and more specifically international organizations within this system. So I want to highlight two specific narratives. The one is international organizations as a place for mediating and preventing conflict, and the other international organizations as a source for kind of replicating the power distribution from a global perspective. So I want to kind of see how these different kind of dimensions of international organizations, and especially the United Nations, work together, what kind of problems they create, and how they are helping to find solutions. So I hope you will enjoy this class. Please stay tuned, and I will go right into the slides. Thank you.
So, as I said just a second ago, we are talking about the United Nations as an international organization. And in this way, we are kind of reflecting the institutional setup of the organization and its power structure at large. In a way, what I would like to focus on is one particular. First, I will give an overview over the organization in more general, but then I would like to focus on one particular institution, and that is the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council is the most powerful organization within the framework of the United Nations. And it's important because it has a unique kind of feature, which is called a veto power. I will explain this in a much more detail in a minute. But this enables it to basically kind of decide more independently what the policies of the United Nations will be and what kind of decisions are unacceptable. So in this way, this specific Security Council is very important, and it has certain features like permanent members and non-permanent members. And we need to kind of understand this in order to see the reflection of the power structure, of the global power structure within the framework of this organization, which is kind of unique for it. So if we kind of think what the United Nations are, we can first see that it's an international organization. It's intended to enforce of international law, security, human rights, economic and social progress of all the countries around the world. So we know the history of the Second World War, and the United Nations came up as a solution to kind of avoid these levels of conflict between international actors, and try to find a forum where governments can mediate conflict and make decisions which are consequential for all actors on a global stage. And therefore, it also kind of tries to be as inclusive as possible with trying to have every country represented within the United Nations. There are certain limitations, but the number of 192 members is quite impressive for an international organization. Much bigger than most other organizations which are existent. If you're ever in New York, you should actually have a look at the headquarters in New York City. It's very impressive and a very nice building. It's very interesting to see also how on a day-to-day time this organization works, how busy they are, how multinational it is. A very interesting experience. So please go there as well if you have a chance. I mentioned already that the Second World War was really important for the history of the United Nations, and also the establishment was in 1945. in order to understand the United Nations, we have to kind of think about its predecessor as well. So after the First World War, there was an attempt, kind of started by Woodrow Wilson in the United States, to build something very similar, a forum for international cooperation where countries can moderate their ideas and therefore enable themselves to find solutions which don't involve conflict like wars. And they came up with something called the League of Nations. This was seen as very positive, a really step forward in for big parts of the world. However, having said that, in the United States, actually, criticism came up, and it was seen as problematic because there is a difference. There's a kind of a trade-off between sovereignty and coordination between different countries in an international forum. And at the end of the day, Congress decided that the United States is not prepared to participate in this organization, which weakened the organization so much that it became basically irrelevant. In 1945, this, of course, there was another attempt to establish the organization, and this time it has been much more successful. So the United Nations have been established in 1945 and are kind of a really important actor until now, and probably within going into the future. So the foundational treaty was the United Nations Charter. It was signed by 51 original members in 1945, and its principal ideas are keeping peace, human rights, and social and economic development. In terms of its core competences, we have many organizations which are under the framework of the United Nations, and human rights peacekeeping is really the kind of core idea. Social economic development, we also have we have more and more activity by the United Nations, and which in the growing role of the SDGs, which most of you are familiar, you can see that this is actually becoming a key part of the United Nations as well. So I think if you kind of look at this, I would like you to pause for a moment and think, just from your experience, what you have read in the newspapers, what you have heard in other classes, etc. How well do you think the United Nations are functioning? And if there are dysfunctionalities, where do you think they come from? Just write this down at this stage. It's not about knowledge, it's just about you thinking about the organization a little bit more. If you have time, please put it on our Padlet site. I'm really happy to read it there, and we'll give you some comments there as well. So make a pause now. Okay, I think you're you're back now, so welcome back, and I will continue with my lecture here. So the United Nations system can be seen in different, it has quite complicated structure, and lots of sub-organizations, organizations which are affiliated in some way with the United Nations, etc. So it's not easy to kind of understand the complete structure of it. However, I will try to do my best to introduce it to you, and also kind of provide you with an overview, which makes it kind of easier to navigate through the organizations. So you have basically 6 principal organs: the General Assembly, the Secretariat, the Security Council, International Court of Justice, Economics and Social Council, and the Trusteeship Council. Then, following from them, there are many other agencies and bodies which are kind of below the level of these principal organs. You might wonder what these organizations, these kind of principal organs are, what their functions are, and I will kind of tell you this step by step. But here is a picture of the overall kind of structure. What you can see here is that overall, at the top, we have these principal organs: the International Court of Justice, the Security Council, the General Assembly, Economic and Social Council, Trusteeship Council, and Secretariat. And then we have these sub-organizations which are belonging under the certain points. Here in the programs and funds, we have many which are, you might be familiar with: UNICEF, UNHCR, just to name two. Here are the regional organizations. Many of these specialized agencies like UNESCO, World Health Organization, the World Bank Group, the International Monetary Fund are also kind of familiar to yourself. All of these organizations are very important in their own right, but they are under these kind of overall principal organs. So as I just mentioned now, there's a summary, you can look through them, what kind of the key organizations. I will not kind of describe their function. You can look that up when we, if you choose to do so. But most of you will be familiar with many of these organizations and parts. Okay, then, so if we go back to these principal organs, we can make a description. And what I want to see here is not just that you learn like each of these organs and think kind of learn their functions, but that you can get an overview how the structure of this organization works, and also from their functionality, where maybe problematic situations online in this in the organizational structure. So the General Assembly is the main is the general body. It's the main body where all the member states are participating and where they are being part of. So you can see it a little bit as the function of a parliament within a democratic state. In a way, the function of the General Assembly is also quite similar. It is not, of course, to pass laws, but at the same time, it's assessing member countries and deciding on the budget and kind of assessing organizational goals and kind of giving more general guidelines. This is the only organ where every country is represented. So it's in this way, it's also very unique. The very important aspect of the General Assembly, which is only convening annually, is that there are kind of special organs and committees which are working much more consistently, which are kind of continuously having progress. And these committees are very important in pushing forward agendas on the international level. Special sessions, of course, can be held by the General Assembly if certain situations arise, but more normally is that there's an annual convention in September of this General Assembly. The Secretariat, at the same time, is a little bit different. The Secretariat can be seen as the actual organizational body behind it. So we do need, in order to have an organization of this magnitude, we do need to have a structural body. And so it is, the function of it is primarily seen as administrative. So it has to kind of keep the organization running. It has to kind of take care of the day-to-day business of the budget. It has to kind of collect information and share it with the member states, etc. So it's a very important part of the organization, but not one which is really a decision-making body, but rather an organizational aspect, part of this organization. So the Secretariat General, though, has considerable freedom in agenda setting, raising issues in the agenda and kind of promoting it to the member states. The Secretariat General holds a position for 5 years per term. The first one was already in 1945, and the office is currently held by Antonio Guterres, following Ban Ki-moon, and will be is currently kind of taking this position. The Secretariat General is normally not a position which is kind of very present in the media, but from time to time, the Secretary General is kind of saying something about current events and raising awareness of problems arising. So, just to get you the gist of it, the Secretariat can be seen as the administrative body, not the decision-making body. Now we get to the Security Council, and the Security Council is generally seen as the most powerful organ within the United Nations. It deals with all the kind of key aspects of decision making, including threats to international peace and security. It's the only body which can kind of, for example, say that the United which has to agree to decisions concerning sanctions for specific member states, but also for peacekeeping missions, etc. So the Security Council is actually the heart of the United Nations, and or at least of the United Nations decision-making bodies. It has 15 members. 5 of these members, the so-called P5, are permanent members. That is really important to understand, because the rest of the members are actually changing over time. The permanent members are always within the Security Council. These 5 members are the successors of the Second World War, and they are the United States, China, Russia, Britain, and France. These P5 have another function which is really more important, because these members have are so-called veto powers, which you can see here. This veto power means that if they are not happy with any decision which has been taken by the or which one should be taken by the Security Council, they can veto this decision. And that means that it will not take place, and without all the P5 agreeing to a decision, it cannot be enacted by the United Nations, no matter how important or how many other countries are in support of it. It only works if these 5 countries unanimously agree to it. Of course, this gives an overproportional level of power to these 5 countries, and that has often been seen as a level of criticism. So in a way, not all of these countries, they are generally seen as very powerful countries, but not all of them are most necessarily the most powerful countries in the world. Especially Britain and France might be seen as actually not as important anymore nowadays, but also in terms of Russia, we had the discussion last week how, especially on the economic front, they are not very powerful, and therefore don't necessarily should not necessarily be in this position. This unequal power structure is often kind of criticized, also because the United States, China, and Russia are often kind of on different sides of a problem, and block each other by not enacting issues which are kind of which are of great concern of the other partners. We have very frequently seen that Russia is vetoing decisions by the Security Council. Less frequently, we have seen that China is doing the same, but also the Western countries, especially, also have been vetoing decisions which were not in their interest. The other situation is that, in a way, these five countries are also more or less untouchable within this framework of the United Nations. So they cannot be sanctions cannot be kind of taken against them. Why? Because they can always veto any decision which is not in their interest, and therefore several countries raised the issue that this unequal, unfair situation or power balance within the organization is harmful for the future of the United Nations. There are several kind of strategies countries are following. In a way, some countries are actually trying to become member of the P5. Japan is a very notable country which would like to become a member of the P5, but also Germany, Brazil, and to some extent South Africa and India are trying to become members of this permanent 5, and therefore kind of have also an overproportional level of power within it. Until now, the structure of these permanent members has not been changed, and it is unlikely that the P5 are kind of agreeing to any change in the power structure. But we can look at this at a later stage, because there are proposals about changing the overall structure of the United Nations, and I will kind of introduce this at a little later stage. Another organization which is really important is the International Court of Justice. So it's principally the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. It's based in The Hague. It consists of 15 judges, which are elected by the General Assembly and the Security Council, so both have to work together. It applies international law. It is not bound to precedents. That means that it actually doesn't need to kind of follow the lead of previous decisions. It can kind of decide independently. And it's not possible to have any appeals against decisions made by this International Court of Justice. So that means like there's no higher court in the land to have an agreement, to be able to appeal to. You might ask now, so what kind of law are they applying? And so we have the international law, which the International Court of Justice is applying. The problem is the enforceability. So there's no real mechanism to enforce this. And especially like if a very powerful country is affected by it, or a country which has the protection of one of the P5s, the permanent members, then lots of these decisions cannot be enforced. What led to a kind of a situation which there have been several landmark cases where, for example, from the in the Yugoslavian war, but also in cases of a genocide like in Rwanda, etc. Individuals have been prosecuted by the International Court of Justice. But it seems that the amount of cases they can take is very limited based on what kind of a conflict they're taking in. For example, it's very unlikely that there will ever be a prosecution of somebody like Assad from Syria for using chemical weapons. Why? Because the Assad regime is very closely linked to Russia. One of the members of the P5, it can always veto any decisions along these lines. So one of the major criticism about the International Court of Justice is that it's not completely independent in the way it applies to the judicial system. And so there are some countries which are more equal than others, and where law not necessarily applies to them. We will have a whole session on international law at a later stage in this seminar series. But to say for now, there has been quite some criticism of the International Court of Justice because of this unequal application of the legal system. In a way, the basis of the United Nations. So I'm talking now about the different organs. I want to kind of now talk a little bit about the basics of the treaty in itself, and the agreement that the countries are taking by becoming member of the United Nations. So the United Charter is a special treaty. It is the kind of the foundation of the United Nations. And a country which wants to become member of the United Nations has to sign this charter. This is basically an understanding that the countries which participate in the United Nations are agreeing with the purpose and the principle of the organization and try to further it. In a way, what we can see down here is that actually over time, there were several episodes, but where the increased where this ratification increased consistently, and now we have a very high level of members participating in the United Nations. So the ratification process of this the UN Charter is, of course, an agreement that that the country is conform with the regulations of the rules of the United Nations, and it's seen as the primary source for any kind of action within the organization. Having said that, not all countries are complying with the spirit of the treaty, and there have been several kind of disputes about this, about the position of countries towards the UN Charter. However, in principle, every country has to agree to the Charter as the foundation of the organization. So if we kind of think about this in terms of, we talked about the International Court of Justice and the UN kind of law, what kind of legal basis there is. The Charter, of course, is the most important legal basis. There are also kind of normative soft laws on human rights, self-determination, peace, security, development, and environment, which are also kind of incorporated in the UN law and which will be considered by the International Court of Human Rights, the International Court of Justice. However, there are also there is also a certain certain aspect which is called hard law, and it includes treaty laws and norms which are purported not necessarily kind of written down in codified ways, but kind of a general way of how countries are dealing with each other. If you kind of think now, this describes how the organization works, but there are several kind of problems I would like to highlight here as well. And one is that this kind of unequalness of the country's power positions within the organization often results in poor organization and consultation on decision-making in international affairs. Why is that the case? Well, because some different idea and interests of different countries might lead to a situation where one bloc is blocking the other kind of group of countries, and therefore no actions are taking place. Another problem is the level of effectiveness. So the more countries have to kind of agree to it, the process itself will also become more cumbersome and lengthy. So one of the problems, for example, about the response of the global financial crisis was not necessarily that the countries had very different ideas what to do, but the process of coming up with a plan, which actually a very capable economist Stiglitz was kind of seen as the most important person there. But this kind of coming up with a plan was so cumbersome and took so long that that in the long run, it was not feasible for the countries to follow the United Nations. And so other organizations, especially in the framework of the G20, was much quicker in adopting certain rules and regulations, which became then the dominant kind of source of global coordination, while the United Nations was actually kind of not as important as you would have thought about such an important issue. Another kind of problem is often that transparency and legitimacy and accountability are a weak spot of it. While the United Nations is a structured organization, which has kind of is rule-based, it is not necessarily the process is often not very transparent, and the problem of unequal power structures is also making it often not really legitimized by the wider group of its members. And one last aspect which I want to raise here is that the role of civil society and the role of business sector is not easily kind of understood. At the one hand, the transparency is not so great, but there's also another problem, and that is that civil society especially is not very well represented in this in the organization, and therefore it is very hard to make its voice heard within this framework. Okay, I have mentioned already several kind of problems the United Nations is generally kind of facing. I want to add a couple of more kind of questions which you can think about by yourself, but also we can discuss in our class. First one is about the Security Council, and I think this will come up in the student presentation as well as in our general discussion quite strongly. But there is, of course, a function of some members which are represented in the Security Council and many members of the United Nations which are not represented. And this kind of raises the question whether this unequal representation is really kind of can really be justified or an organization which should kind of address global problems. Don't we need to have an effective form of representation in a forum which is relevant and important for all our the many members the United Nations have. And there is even a more pressing issue, and that is about the permanent five, which have a veto power, and I discussed this already earlier. But this veto power, of course, gives them over proportional levels of power over all the decisions the United Nations makes, but also over its own its limitations from the organization. So other countries it might be possible to sanction them if their behavior is not what the international community is expecting of them. But for the members of the P5, this is not the same. And anybody who ever read George Orwell's Animal Farm kind of can see quickly some parallels between that and the structure of the United Nations, that there are some which are just kind of better than everybody else. And these countries are not, they cannot be kind of held accountable in the same way the rest of the members can be held accountable. We could have a long discussion whether there are also like how the other representation of of the Security Council is. We find that some countries like Japan, but also Germany and several others, are much more overly present within the organization, and so the representativeness of the Security Council can be seen as a very big problem of it. I think we will have some time to discuss whether it is feasible to apply changes to the structure of the Security Council more specifically. There's one big problem which arises from this, and this is that current permanent five members have to agree to any changes within the structural setup of the United Nations, and it is very unquestionable whether these countries would be willing to reduce their own power position on the benefit of other countries. So one thing is to discuss what would be the best possible solution for having a more representative Security Council. The other thing is to see how realistic these kind of proposals are and how likely it is for the current permanent 5 members to agree to any changes. Yeah. If we look at the General Assembly, we can see like, okay, this is maybe, as I described it as Parliament before, for having a similar position like a Parliament in a representative democracy. But of course, what it represents is not necessarily the citizens of each country, but rather the governments. And the high proportion of authoritarian systems within the United Nations, it might be questionable whether this is actually a representation of the population of the world, or rather like an interest representation of the different countries. We can discuss further whether it should be representative of the population rather than the countries, or whether it is a good thing that the governments are represented in the organization. Having said that, it's an open question, and we should kind of keep that in mind. So another thing is what often is kind of called that ECOSOC is merely a sleeping beauty. So how strong is the United Nations on economic and social issues? We have seen with the recent kind of prominence of the SDGs, people have been much more positive about the role of the United Nations in promoting these kind of goals and kind of also implementing them on a global stage. Having said that, what we have seen in the past is that very often the United Nations is not quick enough to respond to crisis, and also not in social and economic crisis, and that other organizations like the G20 or the G7 are taking over from their positions, because their ad hoc nature makes it much easier for them to find solutions on a shorter time frame, and therefore might be actually more suited, but also kind of preferred by the governments to use as vehicle to kind of have international coordination, rather than this kind of slow tanker of the United Nations. I did not talk much about the Trusteeship Council, which was created in the beginning. It is not much used, and it's kind of often seen as an empty shell. One of the issues which is that we can see with it is that it's still existent, and it's not, basically has no function. The key question is how much reform is actually possible within the framework of the United Nations. So lots of people see it as a symbol of to show that the United Nations is not very capable of changing and adapting to new situations. Even empty parts of the organization cannot be changed, even though the function is not existent at all anymore. So it is seen as often as a symbol. The Trusteeship Council is often seen as a symbol of the kind of stagnant nature of the United Nations. Another kind of issue which is seen is the International Court of Justice. And I have kind of introduced it already and questioned its role on the slide on the International Court of Justice itself. But there is a problem, and that is that if we would expect to have a world court, we would also have to expect that this kind of court is applicable to all actors in the same way. And what we do find is that the court is taking on selected cases which are kind of approved by the Security Council members, and especially by the P5. And therefore it is not necessarily this kind of universal organ for justice, but rather kind of an actor which is kind of working within the constraints which are possibly feasible. That is might be kind of understandable from an organizational setup of the institution, but it is very problematic because several actors feel that this is unfair against them, rather than kind of creating justice. A last point I want to raise here is the Secretary General. What we do find is that, of course, as I said before, the main function of the Secretary General is to be administrative and kind of keeping the function going of the organization. What we do find is that there is certain agency and also kind of agenda setting taking place from the Secretariat in general. So we have an organization which is not necessarily representative as well, and which can be seen as problematic, that the Secretary General might have actually kind of a power structure or a power position which has not been intended initially, and which is kind of not in the same way accountable as other actors would be, and therefore has a problematic structure as well. So if we kind of think of reform, I have a couple of reform suggestions lower down in the presentation, and I'm sure we will talk about kind of reform as well in the student presentation. So I will not go into great detail. But what I want to see is, what I want to show is kind of highlight a certain part, how we can kind of approach change or reform of the security. So we could kind of look at it in very narrow terms on the first point on composition. So is it still adequate to have the P5 as the key members of the Security Council, and kind of should there maybe be other permanent members of the Security Council? Should the council maybe be more representative of the world by including, let's say, countries from Africa or Latin America? Should in any kind of the composition in any kind of way be changed of the organ itself? That's a constant source of debate, and there are many reasons why it is not adequate to have the current composition as it is. But of course, this is not necessarily kind of changing, solving all the problems, because even if the Security Council has more members or different members, and even maybe different permanent members, the inherent inequality and the kind of the situation where some countries have stronger access to the decision making of the United Nations versus others is not solved with it. So some people would actually ask that not necessarily the Security Council membership, the composition of it should be changed, but rather the function. So is it necessary to have an organ which is kind of overall deciding, which is just a subset of all the countries, which is so powerful in itself? Or should it kind of the function of the overall approval rather go to the General Assembly? So we could kind of think about the United Nations basic structure and think whether there is a better way of structuring the decision-making process within the United Nations rather than kind of just tinkering around the composition. A big problem which we do see within the United Nations, and which I have raised already before, is the issue of transparency. Could there be any kind of reform around the level of transparency? Maybe better procedures, kind of visible to all actors. There's several problems with this. The one is that it is very difficult to introduce strong transparency without increasing the workload enormously. The other thing is that members of the United Nations are not necessarily very transparent by themselves and act not necessarily in their governmental positions very transparent. It might not like the idea that the United Nations decision-making is becoming more transparent. The other thing is about transparency is whether what is often called the gap between formal and informal decision making. It might be that formal decision making can be transparent, but the real kind of decision making is taken in the informal proceedings, which again is then not necessarily transparent anymore. There's one aspect of there's two things which I would like to mention very briefly. The one is about the relationship with regional organizations. How much should the United Nations be integrated in regional organizations, and how much interchange should be there? We have strong regional organizations. We have Mercosur in Latin America. We have the African Union in Africa, with the European Union in Europe, and ASEAN and others in Asia. So we do have very strong regional organizations as well. Is there a way to tie them into the functioning of the United Nations and kind of have better interactions between them? So very often it seems like maybe the United Nations should be like the first under many of these international organizations. Or is the United Nations really an organization which has a completely different function than all the others as organizations? And the second one is, and that's why I have this East Timor kind of map on there, is what is often called mission creep. That actually, like, powers are kind of given for one reason, and then the continuation of the status quo makes it difficult to actually change it into something else. And so, how can the United Nations and the Security Council especially kind of become much more effective in their decision? Here I have a recent model of a change of the composition of the Security Council, and what kind of how this could be reformed. I don't want to go into detail. I think we can discuss this much better in class. But this is what I call Model A here. Where we do see a more, like, based on the regions, a more equal proposition of the permanent members of the seats of the Security Council. Whether this makes sense or not, I will leave to the judgment of you guys in class. Here's another kind of a model which is kind of using the different numbers and having different amount of actors, which a big increase in the African countries. The last point I want to kind of ask is basically this: should regional organizations be represented on the Security Council as well? Should the European Union, for example, be an actor at the Security Council, or the African Union, etc.? So these unions might actually kind of, they play an important role in mediating cooperation within the region. So maybe they should play a bigger role at the level of the United Nations as well. And I would like to hear your thoughts on this. Increasing the competencies of regional organizations within the framework of the Security Council as well. There is another kind of alternative idea about the composition of the Security Council, which is making kind of a compromise of it, kind of increasing the number of some of the key players like India, Japan, Brazil, South Africa, which wanted to become members of the Security Council for a long time already, and then at the same time also increasing the participation of the regional organizations, and then having elected members from each region as well. So you have a total of 18. In a way, the question here is, of course, like, still, do we have the composition of the P5 as well, still staying in there as permanent members with a veto power over the others, which gives them over proportional power in the long run. Still, there will be a continuation of the over proportional role of this of the P5 in the long run as well. As a last point, I would like to say, why would actually any change be there? And we could see that that, of course, the United Nations at the moment, or for a very long time after the Second World War, played a key role in international coordination between regions and between the most powerful countries. But of course, this is not written in stone. It might be that actually the kind of the lack the unequal representativeness of the organization, as well as its other problems, might lead to a competition with other organizations, which maybe some countries see as more suitable to follow their goals. And that would be one of the reasons why the United Nations could become really under pressure for change. And that is this idea that maybe it becomes in the long run less relevant. There are some kind of points which I wrote down here, which could kind of keep the relevance and kind of maybe increase even the role of the United Nations as the kind of the key organization to mediate conflict between countries. But as it looks at the moment, we rather see a lower importance to the organizations and then a strong increase in what people and countries are trusting into the organization. So just to give you one example, we can see that even though we have a current pandemic and the World Health Organization has played a key role, it did not, the WHO has come under severe threat, criticism by several countries, and this is even in the situation of a pandemic, it doesn't seem like the United Nations will be at the forefront of all the coordination. So that's it from me for today's presentation and this week's class. I look forward to seeing you in our Zoom class and have a lively discussion on this issue. So yeah, take care, and I see you tomorrow. Bye bye.